So this lesson is entitled Stateless Societies and the Spread of Islam, and this is part one of a four-part series on Africa in the post-classical period. First thing I want you to keep in mind is that Africa is a continent, and Americans often describe Africa as if it is a country or a single place. And that's pretty much exactly wrong. It is still the most diverse continent in the world. In fact, the map that you see here is a map of all the ethnic groups in Africa. And so while Africa is 50-some countries, if it were divided by ethnic groups, it would look something like this. And every time I look at this map, it still just boggles my mind. That there are this many distinct groups of people across this continent. But nevertheless, history is about generalizations. We have to put some kind of scope around this and make generalizations, because if we were to study each of these ethnic groups individually, we would be here for a very long. So the first thing I want you to think about is that Africa is a continent, right? Because Americans often describe Africa as if it is a single country or a single place, which is exactly wrong. Africa is still the most diverse continent in the world. In fact, the map that you're looking at here is a map of all the ethnic groups in Africa, right? So while Africa has, 50-some separate nations, if it were broken up by ethnic groups, this is what the continent would look like. Nevertheless, history is about generalizations, and we have to put some sort of scope around history. And so we are going to look at Africa from a more regional standpoint and, zero in on some of the significant civilizations during this time period. Right, so we'll start with some big generalizations here. Right. First of all, Africa, even into the early post-classical period, was stateless, and that's a vocab term you should know. It relied on clan and tribal organization, not on kings, and that's part of why the map that I showed you previously was broken up into such small groups. And so as we go through this lesson and then the rest of the lessons in this series, we're really going to be looking at the process of state building in the four regions. And in many ways, that state building is very similar to the process of state building in places like Rome and Mesopotamia and India and China, right? So Africa goes through many of the same processes that some of the older civilization groups went through, although it was more influenced by the older civilizations when it did so. Right? A few more generalizations about Africa. Right? Early Africa was largely polytheistic and animist, and that's another key vocab term here. Right? The root here is the word for spirit or soul. Right? So animists believe that everything has a soul. Right? Plants, trees, rocks, dirt, rivers, kind of similar to Greek polytheism. Remember, the Greeks had all the gods of all sorts of different things. God of the north wind, God of the south wind, very similar to African polytheism or animism. And that's still a religion that is practiced in many, many parts of the continent. Africa is also a place of great linguistic diversity. Various sources count anywhere from 1,250 to 3,000 different languages across Africa. There's some debate about what's a dialect versus what's a completely separate language, and that's why we see the different numbers of languages. But compare that to North and South America, where the main religions number 3, and the minor religions, certainly much less than 1,000. So really a remarkable place still, and a variety of climates as well. The map that you see on the bottom here is of the different climate zones in Africa. And so part of what we're looking at here when we look at the different regions is the way civilization developed in different climate zones. And one of the big changes for this time period, remember we always want to be looking at continuity and change over time, one of the big changes was the introduction of Islam. And initially, Islam expanded across North Africa between 640 and 700 CE. So basically the entire region north of the Sahara Desert. And there were many, many conversions of North African peoples under the Abbasid dynasty, and you remember them from our study of the rise and spread of Islam. And then eventually Islam spreads to the south and west with the camel caravans. Now these are the people who primarily did this were the so-called Berbers, the desert nomads, who took advantage of the camel and its ability to traverse the desert. And the Berbers were primarily a trading people. They would take, trade goods like salt and gold down from West Africa up north, also move salt from the salt mines of the Central Sahara down south into West Africa, and then a lot of what they brought back from North Africa were manufactured goods and things that had come along the spice roads and silk routes into the Mediterranean basin. Right? And Islam had some important effects on Africa at this time period. Right? I mean, this idea in Islam that everyone is equal in the Ummah also, gave kings the ability to unify political and religious power, right? So the power of the priests comes in and becomes also the power of the kings. And Islam introduces a common language, which is Arabic, right? Because for Muslims, the Quran can only be in Arabic. So these converts to Islam had to learn Arabic, and so that kind of, and various parts of Africa are still this way. People speak their local tribal languages, their local ethnic languages, but then they'll also speak Arabic because they're Muslim. It's also brought in the system of common law known as Sharia, and this is the legal system of Islam. And this also connected Africa to those wealthier trade networks by affinity. And affinity networks rather, is an interesting idea, right? The fact that it just kind of equals like people who are like-minded, who have similar cultures are said to have affinity networks. So Muslims are going to get along better with Muslims than they are with Jews or Christians. It's just a natural affinity. Or boys will get along better with boys than they will with girls. It's just a natural affinity. And so those affinity networks allowed Africa to, particularly West Africa and East Africa, to connect to the growing trade network that was happening within the larger Muslim world. So, important things here, right? Common language, common law, affinity connections. This sort of jump starts civilizational development and state building within Africa in the post-classical period. Right? Kind of also some negative, well, not kind of, I mean, absolutely some negative effects of Islam as well. This increased patriarchy throughout the continent, right? Traditional African societies are either very egalitarian, meaning men and women are equal, or even slightly matriarchal, meaning the women have more power and say within social decisions and even political decisions. And this also created some hierarchy, right? Because while everyone is equal in the eyes of Allah, under Islam, once you start having kings and aristocrats come along, you've got some top dogs and then you've got just the normal folks. And so that increases hierarchy as well. And actually slavery was introduced to Africa by Muslims, although very different from the slavery that we're going to look at in period 4 of world history. Slavery in Islam was temporary, often used as a means of conversion to Islam, as in someone would be taken slave, and then as long as they converted to Islam, they were freed. And it was often, moved eastward, right? So it was either local or trans-Saharan slavery. In fact, many slaves ended up going off to India and sometimes even as far as China, right? So there was slavery on the continent under the Muslims, long before European slavery. All right, so final notes here, and this is, one of our driving questions for this unit, right? What's the best way to unify large groups of people, politics, culture, or economics? And why do you think this? So in this lesson, we see that it's really the cultural change of Islam as well as connections to the World Trade Network that are going to start this process of state building and state formation in Africa in the post-classical period. Thanks for watching.